my name is Salem Stoll, and I am the current project coordinator for the Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research. And today I will be interviewing Dr. Kayla Burd. Dr. Burd is our current National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Stipend Competition Junior Candidate. The NEH Summer Stipends Program aims to stimulate new research in the humanities and its publications. These summer stipends support continuous full-time work on humanities project for a period of 2 consecutive months. Each year, the Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research, on behalf of the University of Wyoming, nominates 2 candidates, one junior and one senior, for this NEH competition. I'm excited to be here with Dr. Kayla Burd, and I hope you're excited to hear about her current research. Hello, Dr. Kayla Burd. Can you tell me what you do on the UW campus?
Absolutely. I'm an assistant professor of psychology, and I'm in the cognitive area as well as the psychology and law area. Most of my work focuses on the impact of biases and extra-legal factors that can impact memory, reasoning, and decision-making, particularly in legal contexts. So my students and I work on trying to tackle issues regarding how biases can influence decision-making in the legal system and how those decisions lead to disparate treatment for people across the country. And so sometimes we try to do less depressing work and we try to find interventions to reduce bias in legal contexts to try to improve equity in the system.
What is your current project that you sent in for the NEH stipend?
So in this project, I'm hoping to analyze the juvenile system in Wyoming, kind of coming at that analysis from a legal, historical, and developmental perspective. And so we're kind of in this pivotal moment right now across the country as well as in Wyoming regarding issues for system-involved youth. And so there's been a lot of momentum across the country and quite a bit of momentum here in Wyoming as well, pushing to study these issues to really get to the bottom of the best way to approach system-involved youth. And we are a bit behind in Wyoming in terms of having our legislation align with the best way to tackle these issues that's most developmentally appropriate for these youth. And so this project is going to try to update the literature that's out there so far. There's been really good review and synthesis of the inner workings of the juvenile system in Wyoming up to about 2010. So I'm going to try to pick up there and review things that have been going on since 2010. And then most importantly, in the latter part, I'm going to try to focus on evidence-based, data-driven suggestions for ways to improve the juvenile system here, grounding that in developmental science. So trying to make suggestions regarding policies that we could enact that would be hopefully really beneficial for the youth in the state generally, but most importantly for system-involved youth here in the country and in Wyoming.
When was the last time this was updated, or the system has been updated in Wyoming?
Yeah. Recently, there was a lot of momentum, and luckily the legislatures decided to pick up the issue of juvenile justice. So they've been studying it recently in their interim sessions. So there was success for one proposed bill, which was focused on data collection across the state. So before this bill passed, there were no standardizations in terms of data collection across the state. It was really hard to gather the data, and there is no central place where the data has been stored. So it's been really hard to get to the bottom of really the experience of these youth in the state. And it's really hard to know which policies might be helping them or harming them in some way. So I think this was an incredible, really important first step to have that data and to be able to see, are there disparities in the juvenile system? Who's most impacted by these policies? Who is most likely to become system involved, and what does that look like for those kids across the lifespan? So it was a monumental change. It was really important that happened. We still have a lot of work to do.
What got you interested in this project specifically?
That's a great question. My own training is in developmental psychology, but it was really interdisciplinary. So I also had training in law, psychology, and human development. And so my first interest regarding youth that were involved in the system was more from a child witnessing perspective. So a lot of my early research looked at child witnessing issues and how adults think about kids and when they're accurate or inaccurate in their thoughts about children. But then upon moving here, I have a graduate student who's very interested in issues surrounding the juvenile system. She herself actually worked in a detainment center in Alabama, and so she saw firsthand all of the disparities that youth face, minoritized youth or youth that come from poverty. And so she saw all those injustices firsthand. And in starting our work together, we became really interested in examining that here in Wyoming as well. And so then we lucked out because I have a lot of wonderful colleagues here at UW who've really been dedicated to trying to fix this system for several decades. And then all of a sudden we just stumbled upon all these folks trying to work on these issues, and we joined what we call the Wyoming Youth Justice Coalition. And so that's a body of system-involved families and children, advocates, scholars, all trying to work together to enact these changes in the system. So it really took off from there. The group formed for the first time ever. We were able to get a little bit of insight into the data that was available at the time regarding the youth in Wyoming, and we were able to conduct some statistical analyses and get a better sense of what was going on. And there were a lot of disparities. So we found a lot of evidence, particularly of racial disparities across the state. And so we saw that although children across time were perhaps being detained a little less, the number of white youth that were experiencing out-of-home placement was dropping across time. The number of youth that were being called delinquents, that were minoritized youth, that was remaining stable across time. So we weren't seeing improvements for all of the groups. And so we ran some additional analyses and found that for youth in Wyoming, Black youth are 4 times more likely to be sent to out-of-home placements compared to white youth. And so this issue really took off from there. Once we had this data to show factually in an evidence-based way that there are large discrepancies, I really became passionate about trying to, shine some light on these issues with my colleagues that are doing the same work.
That's super interesting, especially when you think about the racial population in Wyoming. Do you want to explain that a little bit?
Absolutely. Those numbers are startling for many reasons, but we have such a large white youth population here, so it really highlights those racial disparities even more, because some of our data suggests that despite the fact that there's a very low amount of minoritized children in Wyoming, they're still increasingly likely to become system involved compared to white youth. And so it's pretty illuminating to see, how such a small group of children could still become system involved when proportionally there's so few of them in the state.
And can I ask how many facilities there are in the state for, I was going to use the term detaining youth, but I don't think that's the correct statement.
That's a great question. The largest 2 are the Wyoming Boys School and the Wyoming Girls School. Mm-hmm. So that is probably the primary detainment center, but mm-hmm. You'll note that they call them schools because there is education occurring in the facilities, mm-hmm. But those children can't freely leave. So from my perspective, they are being detained. And then there are other sorts of out-of-home placements. So that might include other things like group homes or even mental health facilities. So there's a lot of different ways that children can be placed outside the home.
Could you define specifically what out-of-home placement means in this situation?
So as I mentioned earlier, Wyoming has one of the highest youth confinement rates across the country. But the definition of confinement has become pretty contentious. Some individuals would argue that confinement only counts for facilities like the Wyoming Boys School or Girls School. But from a developmental perspective, I use a broader definition. And so I would consider confinement anytime a child cannot freely leave a facility. So in that broader definition, that would include things like the Boys School and Girls School, but also places like group homes or mental health facilities, anytime a child can't freely leave and rejoin their family. And so, importantly, the literature doesn't differentiate from a legal perspective what confinement is. Developmentally, people are looking at any time a child is taken out of the home and placed in a facility wherein they can't leave.
What would you say is the scope of this project? Is it just strictly Wyoming you're looking at?
So it's going to be a little bit of both. I'm kind of using Wyoming as a case study. The primary emphasis will be Wyoming. But throughout, I'm going to try to note that these are things that the whole country is grappling with. Now, some countries have a very different way of handling, youth in general. But in America, as you know, we are suffering from a severe mass incarceration problem, and that trickles down to youth as well. And so although a few states within the country have been making really good progress towards developing developmentally sensitive processes for youth, a lot of states are a little behind. And so we're kind of in this position where we now have data from other states that we can look to see all the progress they're making and how important those changes have been for youth in terms of outcomes, but also financially for those states. And so the main focus will be on Wyoming, but there will be nods to comparator states, if you will, trying to address the success that other states have been having to shine light on this idea that we now have data to see, how successful other states have been in making more progressive decisions regarding youth.
Would you say Wyoming is unique in this issue?
I would not say it's alone, but we do have one of the highest confinement rates in the whole country. So we are unique in that way. So other states, similarly, suffer from high confinement rates, but we are at the top of that list in terms of youth confinement. So I would say that we are a bit unique in that way.
What's the most, compelling thing you've found in your research so far?
That's a great question. I think a lot of that comes from the preliminary data that we were allowed to gather and analyze. And so I would say the most important finding so far was that we finally have numbers to support the idea that there are huge racial disparities in terms of youth out-of-home placements in the state. And we know that most of those children come from impoverished backgrounds. And so it's really important to note that we have such a high confinement rate, that there are large racial disparities, but more importantly, from a developmental perspective, we have so much good literature and data suggesting that confinement has really negative downstream consequences for children, but not only for those children who experience out-of-home placement, but for future generations as well. So there's a robust literature that shows pretty strongly that children who have earlier contact with the system, children who suffer earlier confinement, they have increased negative consequences across the lifespan. And so these children are more likely to suffer economic disadvantage across the lifespan. They're less likely to graduate school. They're less likely to have employment. They're more likely to start their own families earlier on. And then their own children are just as likely to experience these issues as they are. So it's really an issue because it's not just these isolated experiences where one child is suffering. This impacts all of their future generations as well. And so I think it's really important to note that although we didn't have data in Wyoming to show all the troubles with confinement, we have a robust literature suggesting how damaging it can be to place children in out-of-home placements. And so what I hope to draw attention to is the idea that not only is it very expensive, which unfortunately the state cares a lot about expenses, it's very expensive and it's very damaging. And so if we could turn our attention to more preventative measures, if we could provide better education to children, if we could provide more mental health services, these children may never become system involved. But once they are system involved, there are just a host of downstream negative consequences that come from that. And so I hope to draw the parallels from the psychological literature to these issues to show why these different policies really make long-term substantive impacts not only on these children but on the future generations as well.
Are you from Wyoming or?
No.
So how long have you been in Wyoming?
I came here in the fall of 2020, pandemic times, when I was on my computer at home on Zoom, feeling like I hadn't even become a professor actually. It's hard to know your role or your place at home, but luckily when the world started to open up a little more, that's when we were able to join forces with others that have been working on these issues for so long. But I'm originally from New Jersey.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, then another thing, since you pointed out the pandemic, how has the pandemic specifically affected this issue?
That's a great question. In a lot of ways, I think it has worsened mental health for everyone. And so, because it's so recent, there's not a ton of data, but the data does suggest that across the board, folks are suffering from more mental health issues than before. And so I think that definitely compounds this issue.
Well, thank you so much for meeting with me. My last question is honestly, is there any books you'd recommend either on this topic or just in general?
Yeah, there are a lot of good reads on issues that I think all relate to this topic. And so the first I would recommend is a book by Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt called Biased. And so she does a wonderful job kind of merging personal narratives with findings from psychological science, showing how biases form, how they permeate the day-to-day, and how they impact large structures, including the legal system. And so she does a great job of illuminating just how powerful prejudice is and all the ways it can impact our day-to-day when we are even unaware of the biases that we have. And she does a great job of highlighting how this plays out for people in this country. I would also recommend Convicting the Innocent by Brandon Garrett. So that does a great job talking about wrongful conviction in the United States. And he does a really good job of describing the key features that you see in trials involving wrongful conviction. So things like flawed forensic science, eyewitness misidentification, the impact of false confessions, and just how often we can get it wrong and the impact that that can have. And I would also suggest American Juries by Drs. Neil Vidmar and Valerie Hans. They do a really great job talking about the American jury system, how the American jury system came to be, the strengths of the jury system, and some vulnerabilities. And I think they just do a great job talking about how lay people are tasked with this enormous burden, you might think of it, when justice is in their hands, and all of the complex cognitive processes that go into jury decision making, and how all these factors, including moral or social norms, can shape our perceptions and interpretation of evidence, and what that looks like in a group context. So I think that's a really important piece as well.
All right, well, thank you so much for speaking with me. I'm just excited to learn more about your project, and I'm excited to see what kind of work you get done this summer.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you so much for watching. If you're interested in seeing some of the Institute's other lectures and interviews, feel free to do so on our YouTube channel. For more information about our organization, you should join our mailing list at www.uwyo.edu/humanities. We always appreciate it when you like, comment, or subscribe. Thank you!